Well, welcome everyone. Thank you very much for joining us this afternoon. This event is entitled Innovation and Resiliency, Human Rights Organizations During the Pandemic. And I'd like to thank very much our panelists, Marcy Hersh from Women Deliver, Jessica Stern from Outright International, Louis Bickford from Memria, and Arielle Newton from Amnesty International USA. I'd also like to thank Iain Levine, who's on faculty at the School of International and Public Affairs at Columbia University, who has kindly agreed to moderate this event. I'd like to let everyone know that it will be recorded and available online. And after a discussion with our panelists, we're going to be taking questions. So if you can kindly just type your questions into the chat, we'll then share them with our moderator. And Iain, I'll turn it over to you. Thanks, everyone.
That's great. Thank you. Thanks, Kristina, and thanks for giving me the chance to be part of this. I'm very excited to be here with a great panel, and I'm very happy to see some of my former students at SIPA. So a special welcome to you. It's very nice to see you. The UN Secretary General, Antonio Guterres, described the COVID pandemic as the greatest challenge to the UN system since its founding in 1946. It's a crisis of public health. It's clearly an economic crisis for people around the world. And it's obviously an enormous challenge for the human rights movement. And that's what we're going to be talking about today. What is the innovation and resiliency needed from human rights organizations and human rights activists to face the enormous range of human rights issues which are being thrown up by the COVID pandemic. We can clearly see that the pandemic is both an opportunity for governments to recognize the importance of international cooperation and international solidarity and international commitment to the universal values of human rights, or it is an opportunity, as we've already seen with some governments, to consolidate power, to suppress free speech, to suppress a free press, and to exacerbate discrimination and existing inequalities and vulnerabilities. And there's a whole range of human rights issues which I hope that we're going to touch on today. There's clearly the whole question of the right to health, and particularly for those most disadvantaged in our societies, the poor, racial and ethnic minorities, refugees and migrants, LGBT communities, those with disabilities, women and children and others. There's the whole question of inequality and discrimination and the extraordinarily unequal way in which the pandemic is affecting particularly those who are beginning with disadvantage. We can't talk about social distancing, obviously, for those who are homeless, who are living in detention, and hand washing doesn't work if you don't have access to clean water. There are many questions being raised about what are reasonable and acceptable limits on certain freedoms and rights, such as freedom of movement and freedom of assembly. The issue of access to information, a critical human right, has become even more to the fore as we see just how critical accurate and timely information is to the right to life, and the impact of the spread of harmful misinformation, disinformation, whether it's about social distancing, whether it's about chloroquine as a drug, or whether it is memorably about whether or not one should inject oneself with disinfectant. So there are many critical human rights questions which the pandemic has raised, as well as really profound issues for the human rights movement, for human rights organizations and activists. For the most part, we are stuck in our homes. We are unable to travel and work with victims and witnesses and partners as we would normally expect to. This affects our ability to investigate, to document, to tell the stories of those affected, to lobby, to advocate, to protest. How are we dealing with that? How are we developing new ways of working in order to continue our activism? And obviously the economic impact of the pandemic is creating huge anxieties amongst NGOs and non-for-profits, and real worries about funding shortfalls and what they will mean for all of our abilities to do our work. And in addition, of course, on a personal level, many of us are at home. We're dealing with family and kids and work and the well-being, our own well-being and the well-being of family members and colleagues. And so how are we dealing with all those things? So a lot of issues to cover. a great group of people. I'm not going to go into long bio details, but we have a really nice range of experience, diverse experiences and areas of expertise, and I'm really excited to work with the panel. So I want to start off, if I can, with sort of perhaps the most obvious but a really important question, which is simply, what are the main human rights impacts of COVID that you're seeing in your work? And Marcy, if I can start with you. You're working particularly with women and children in humanitarian settings, and I'd love to hear your insights and assessment of how COVID is impacting the human rights impact of the communities that you're working with.
Thank you so much, Iain, and thank you to Kristina and all the organizers. This is just such a fantastic opportunity to be together with a slightly different group of experts than I usually get to meet with and work with. So thank you for the opportunity to be with you today, and for everyone who's tuning in. I know there are lots of demands on our time right now. So to answer your important question, it's sort of hard to know where to begin. There are so many implications for girls and women, in particular, those who are living in acute crisis settings, who I think are facing some of the most severe challenges. You can imagine, for those who've been forcibly displaced from their homes, they're living in camps or they're living in urban settings. It sort of doesn't matter where they're living. We know that they are going to have extremely limited access to all of the things that keep you safe and healthy in this time, right? So extremely limited access to health care services, extremely limited access to water, sanitation, and hygiene. As Iain made reference in his opening remarks, access to clean water, access to soap. These are things that we can, so luckily in New York City take for granted for women and girls who are living in refugee settings or other forcibly displaced settings. It is absolutely not a foregone conclusion that you would have these items. And then finding safety in being able to access the places where you would go to wash your hands, right? I have joked for many years that I need to get a tattoo across my forehead about just getting locks on latrine doors for girls and women in refugee settings. It's something that I have written so many reports about, and yet we see this over and over again. It is not safe for girls and women, more often than not, to access places to shower, to wash, to go to the bathroom. And right now, this is truly life or death. I want to quickly, while I have the floor, just to mention a couple of statistics that I think really elucidate explicitly what this crisis will mean for girls and women around the world. So first of all, the health workforce is mostly women. It's 70% women. They're on the front lines, and yet we know that very infrequently are they compensated appropriately or included in high-level leadership, which means that their decisions, their experiences are not fed into response planning. That's obviously not acceptable. UNFPA just put out a number of really alarming statistics around sexual and reproductive health care and gender-based violence this week that are just a massive wake-up call of, I think, what's been in the media and what we've known to be sort of coming down the pike. But these numbers, I think, are really quite shocking. So they say that 47 million women are not going to be able to access contraception because of challenges in the supply chain that are happening all around the world, which is going to lead to at least 7 million unintended pregnancies. You can imagine the shock that that puts on already stressed households, in particular in acute vulnerable settings. With regard to gender-based violence, there's been quite a lot written and talked about with regard to the uptick of gender-based violence. It's estimated that 31 million additional new cases of gender-based violence are going to be happening, and that an additional 2 to 3 million will happen for every additional 2 to 3 months of lockdown. So this just fuels my own personal and my organization Women Delivers commitment to sort of double down on our advocacy to support the grassroots women's organizations that we work with all around the world, to push on the UN system, to push on government donors, to all make sure that women's rights and these considerations are front and center in COVID response planning. I'll stop there.
Do you want to say just a little bit more on the issue of gender-based violence? I've seen a lot of reports from many different countries in the world, so highly developed as well as developing, about the fears that being locked up at home with families and with abusers is a huge issue. Very, very difficult, even in some cases, for women to call attention of the police or other authorities in order to seek protection, and nowhere for them to go in situations of lockdown. Any thoughts about what needs to be done differently to address the problem?
Yeah, so thank you for raising that. It's even under the best of circumstances, finding ways for women and women with children to be able to extricate themselves from homes with an abuser are very delicate and very challenging. And this current situation has just exacerbated those challenges. You know, under more normal circumstances, you would think that you'd be able to flee to a safe space, to a shelter. Many of those shelters are not currently operating, or they're operating at different capacity or limited capacity. Oftentimes making those phone calls, emergency phone calls to 911 or to other service providers, can't be done, you know, in the presence of the abuser. But finding a safe space to be able to make a private phone call when you're living in a small space is frankly impossible. So it's requiring service providers to really think outside the box about how to continue to provide these lifelines to women who truly need a lifeline. What we're seeing with a program that I manage in Lebanon supports a number of grassroots women's organizations, many of whom work on gender-based violence in particular. And they have noticed that their helplines, their emergency hotlines that they offer for survivors of gender-based violence the call volume has increased threefold over the last number of months. And so it requires money to be able to maintain those lines, to keep them going, and then also just staff to be able to keep it going as well. And then to be able to find, it's just a lot of creative thinking to find ways to extricate women and where to send them to. A challenge in New York City, a challenge in the United States, and even more of a challenge, as you can imagine, in very resource-poor settings.
Right. Jessica, I want to turn to you. You're Executive Director of Outright International. You have a long history of leadership on issues of human rights in LGBTQI communities, and would love to hear from you about what you're seeing as the main human rights impact of the COVID epidemic in your work and the work of Outright International.
Thank you so much, Iain, and thank you very much to the organizers for putting this together. As Iain said, I lead a global LGBTIQ rights organization called Outright International, and we have staff and offices in 8 countries globally, 2 in Asia, 1 in East Africa, 2 in Europe, 2 in Asia, and a global headquarters in the US. And so when the COVID pandemic started to sweep around the world, we felt the impact of it quite quickly because of our offices and partnerships throughout Asia. And, you know, it became, the experiences of our colleagues in Asia became kind of like a warning for all of the work that we do internationally. And so we sprang into action with 2 main platforms for response. One is a global research report that we're releasing on May 7th called Vulnerability Amplified, the Impact of COVID-19 on LGBTIQ Communities Globally. And the other was an emergency response fund for LGBTIQ grassroots organizations impacted by COVID-19. And we felt these 2 interventions were important in equal measure. You know, to what our first objective would be to queer governments and donors and humanitarian agencies' response to the crisis. We know from history that response to global health crises, to natural disasters, tend to focus not on the beautiful gender-based response that our colleague from Women Deliver just said we all need, but sort of interventions at the mass level, which overlooks the fact that certain communities who were vulnerable before are going to fall through the cracks without very specific and targeted interventions. So the first thing we set out to do was to gather data. How were LGBTIQ people being distinctly impacted by COVID? And the other thing we set out to do is to resource the frontline grassroots LGBTIQ organizations that are the lifeline to LGBTIQ people on a good day and are certainly going to make all the difference to their survival amidst a crisis. And so to Iain's question, what did we find? The global research report really identified 7 main forms of crisis. And I'm just going to pull up the overview very quickly. First is a devastation of livelihoods and rising food insecurity. And the way I would explain that is that LGBTIQ people around the world live on the razor's edge of poverty on a good day. And so when suddenly you can't go out and collect a subsistence livelihood, you can't work at the market on a daily basis, you don't have reserves to fall back on. And so Outright started to hear literally immediately from partners and grassroots community members that they were experiencing food shortages. And to just illustrate this very quickly, I got an urgent email from colleagues in Sri Lanka as the pandemic began to impact that country. And they said, could you please buy groceries quickly for 65 members of our community that find themselves destitute? And I can tell you that as a human rights organization that works primarily on civil and political rights, I was actually quite surprised that Outright was getting an emergency appeal for food aid. Well, the next day, I got a similar request from colleagues in Indonesia. This time, they were asking for emergency food support for 640 transgender women in Jakarta. So it was really quite shocking to see the food instability come in so quickly. The second issue we found was radical disruptions in healthcare and medical access. So along with all of the issues that everyone else is experiencing in the context of COVID, LGBTIQ people who can't access HIV and AIDS medications, or transgender people who depend on hormones for their well-being, their sense of self, are suddenly finding barriers to access. Something as simple as access to hormones is often considered a non-essential service. But of course it's essential if you depend on it to be who you are. And then a third theme that I think really complements Marcy's comments very, very profoundly is the radical spike in domestic violence. So you may have heard Secretary General Gutierrez say, you know, not only do we need a ceasefire on fighting and conflicts, we also need a ceasefire on domestic violence. Unfortunately, the Secretary General's statement only acknowledged the ways that women and girls are at heightened risk for domestic violence. Absolutely, women and girls are targeted. There's no doubt about that. But Outright has also documented a radical increase in domestic violence targeting LGBTIQ people. And it makes sense. You know, if you're suddenly stuck at home with your family, with your parents who want you to dress a certain way, look a certain way, marry a person of a certain sex or gender, you're not safe. And Iain, I just realized I wasn't looking at the clock. So even though I have so many useful things to say, I want to just ask you if I have another minute or if I should wrap up.
Another couple of minutes will be fine.
Okay, thank you. And just to name them but not elaborate on them, we're also seeing the community report increased isolation and anxiety, and really deep fears about social stigma, discrimination, violence, and scapegoating. So we've been hearing in country after country, do you know why we have COVID? Well, COVID is punishment to the West for acknowledging and recognizing LGBTIQ rights. And the next, and we even heard it from Pat Robertson here in the United States last week. It's a tried and true refrain, but actually it really destabilizes the safety and security of LGBTIQ people. The sixth theme would be instances of abuse of state power. There have been some high profile cases of this in the past 2 weeks. I think it's going to get much worse, that we're just seeing the tip of the iceberg. You may have heard that Ugandan government authorities raided an LGBTIQ homeless shelter in the country. What was the excuse that they gave? Social distancing. In the name of COVID, we're going to disrupt the shelter. Well, I can tell you that people were sheltering safely. It was, you know, a community that had every right to be together. But in the name of COVID, the government justified arresting and detaining 19 people who've now been in jail for over 3 weeks. The government of Hungary is using these extraordinary circumstances to attempt to erase the legal gender identity recognition that exists for transgender people. And in the context of Liberia, we saw a right-wing government official say, you know what, while no one's looking, let's take that sodomy law and let's make it even worse. And what the Liberian parliamentarian proposed was, if you are arrested on sodomy charges, you are not eligible for bail. Just imagine. That's what he was thinking about amidst this public health global crisis. So I'll just wrap up by saying the complementary fear that we have is that without an infusion of emergency support, that the LGBTIQ organizations that are already fragile could fall apart. They don't have deep pockets, and this crisis could put them back years. Thanks, Iain. Thanks,
Jessica. That was troubling, but very interesting, and you covered some great ground. And I think we're seeing both from you and Marcy already, a theme of existing abuses intensified in this context. So, for example, I was very struck by the hate speech, which obviously is a very common feature, but the fact that COVID is giving kind of people an extra pretext for mobilizing it, which is, and we're seeing that, it's interesting, we're seeing that in India, for example, with hate speech against Muslim communities, building on many years of hate speech, but now there's sort of a new pretext. I want to turn to Arielle from Amnesty USA. Arielle, welcome. It's great to have you with us. I mean, Amnesty obviously covers many countries and many issues, but I'm interested, well, I'll definitely want to ask you more about your work as a field organizer and the world of virtual organizing, but just say a word perhaps about Amnesty's work on the issues of people in detention, people in prisons and immigration detention, and some of the particular risks that they run from the epidemic, living in situations where there's no proper protection.
Great. Hi, everyone. So happy to be here. Yes, my name is Arielle, and I'm a field organizer with Amnesty International USA. And in that role, I'm tasked with mobilizing our members to take action on certain human rights concerns. There's been a number of human rights abuses and violations and concerns in light of this COVID crisis. I think Marcy and Jessica did an amazing job outlining how this crisis is severely impacting those who are incredibly marginalized. And included in that group are people currently in detention at the border and, of course, throughout the United States. So we're already in a very harsh and partisan political climate in which Islamophobia, xenophobia, nativism, racism, etc., are plagues that are normalized via, our own government representatives, certain media outlets, etc. So it's already very difficult trying to respond with a human rights-centered approach in releasing migrants and refugees from detention, particularly from the southern border. What we're seeing now is that not only does that stigma still remain, but it's even further fueled by the fears of having too many people being in this country. So we're seeing that there are calls to halt immigration. We're seeing that there's a lot of doubling down on the xenophobia that already frightened us from before. Currently in detention, I'll just say it flatly, social distancing is impossible. You cannot social distance when you are confined to a space. And we've seen some very troubling pictures of people who are currently in detention who are quote unquote socially distancing, but it doesn't meet any standard that would be acceptable for us. And then further, we know that already the detention system is swarmed with the most vulnerable and the most impacted. But we've had conversations with people who are currently detained who are pregnant, people who are children, people who do not speak English. And that can be incredibly difficult of a consideration given this crisis. So we remain incredibly concerned about what's happening with ICE. We remain incredibly concerned about what's happening with the DHS, and we have been very hawkish to track developments and advocate for the release of people who are currently detained due to their immigration or migrant status and asylum-seeking status. And that's been a significant portion of our human rights response, but there's been a number of other issues that we've grown incredibly uncomfortable by as well that I just wanted to mention here briefly. So like Marcy and Jessica said, we are recognizing that domestic or intimate partner violence is spiking. And that forms into our ending gun violence work related to the fact that in many instances of IPV, a gun is used in often fatal situations. Another element to our gun violence work is safe storage. So one thing that we're also tracking is the fact that now that children are out of school and there are guns that are not stored safely in the home, there's an increased risk of children dying as well. Further, we're monitoring hate crimes and looking at the fact that we've seen a spike in gun sales during this time, and we are unsure or unclear, but we can make a very reasoned guess why people in particular communities are buying guns, especially with the xenophobia and nativism that is coming from our president. And then, of course, we are very much concerned about tech and big data, and looking at how data and technology is being used to further marginalize people and invade privacy rights. That's a growing and burgeoning scope of work that we are paying close attention to, because we can rest assured when we see stories of Google and Apple putting aside their differences to track COVID cases, it's not just for humanitarian benefit in mind. There's definitely something underscoring why two tech giants will suddenly merge to track people's movements. We remain concerned about labor and income inequality. We particularly turn our eye to Amazon and how Jeff Bezos is profiting handsomely while his workers are not given access to PPE. And then, of course, we're looking at racial equity as well, because we remain concerned about the spike in hate crimes that we're seeing. Also, the health disparities that we're seeing and who is treated and who is not. How specifically looking at Black communities, how does the fact that now we are forced to wear masks, how does that fuel racial profiling? How does it fuel people's feeling I fear for my safety, et cetera? Just recently, a man was jogging and a Black man was jogging, and his father and son duo killed him because they feared for their lives. And so that's definitely something that we grow concerned about. And then finally, I just want to wrap about something that hasn't seen that much light of day, but climate change, right? And the fact that already the climate was in a very precarious and unstable situation. It's already led to significant health disparities by race. The fact that environmental racism is a sad reality, even here in New York City, especially here in New York City. We recognize how disruptions to the climate is further impacting how this healthcare inequality is spreading as well. When you have people who are already disproportionately sick due to pollutants that have been in the air, asthma, et cetera, we are concerned that a already fragile healthcare system has been completely further destabilized by the influx of people who are sick. And to us, it's not a surprise that most of the people who are going in for sickness and who are less likely to be believed for their sickness are Black and brown people who have been exposed to pollutants all their life. So we have this multi-pronged approach. We call it our human rights centered approach to this COVID crisis. And we want to underscore the fact that this pandemic did not create these problems. It merely exacerbated them, amplified them, and underscored them. And we're working with our membership nationwide, even if we're on lockdown and quarantining, to address these issues as readily and speedily as possible. So I'm really excited to have this conversation with you all today.
Thanks, Arielle. Thanks for raising a really interesting range of issues. I'm glad you mentioned the issue of surveillance. I think the whole question of the influence of online platforms, both for good. After all, we are all dependent on this, on Zoom to have this conversation. Most of us are spending an enormous amount of our time online, both for work and our personal lives. But at the same time, there are all sorts of very, I think, big questions about information, misinformation, and concerns about what are the legitimate limits of surveillance and contact apps. So, what role can those kind of at play without violating our rights to privacy and integrity. And I hope those are issues that will come up. Just a reminder that we're asking you, if you have questions of any of the panelists or all of the panelists, to put them down in the chat, and Kristina will help to pull them out so that we can share them with the panelists in just a few minutes. I want to turn to Louis Bickford. Louis has a long track record of engagement on human rights issues with the International Center for Transitional Justice and the Ford Foundation for a long time. He's now the founder and CEO of a group called Memria. And Louis, you're working to collect stories and narrative accounts of violence as part of the contribution to human rights work. Talk to us about how COVID is impacting both the kinds of issues that you're encountering, the kind of stories that people are telling you, but also how it is that you are able to gather those stories when presumably you're not able to physically visit people and communities the way you normally do.
Yeah, well, maybe to put that in a kind of a bigger context of some of the potential opportunities here. And Iain, tell me if I'm jumping ahead to a later point in the discussion, but a couple of the kinds of opportunities in terms of organizing and organizational stuff. I mean, there are a lot of huge challenges too, and that's also something I'd be interested in talking about, is challenges. I'm talking now really about the organizational level and, fundraising and, those kinds of things. And I guess we'll probably come to that as well. But since you were asking me about Memria, I mean, essentially we're an online platform that helps with the remote collection of testimony and testimonials and the processing of that using machine learning and distribution, et cetera. And actually, this has been a bit of a boom time for us, the same way that it's boom time for Zoom, et cetera. And that's because, so for example, we're working with the Truth Commission in Colombia, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission in Colombia, and they kind of came to us and said, we can't go do this physical collection anymore. We can't go do our events. Can we work together to figure out a way to substitute doing those physical events and the in-person testimony gathering with online tools and web-based tools and even things like WhatsApp. In Colombia, WhatsApp voice memos are extremely common. Not so common in the US, but it's a way in which you can get people to narrate experience. And there are a lot of security concerns around internet-based things, obviously confidentiality, privacy, things like that. And we can talk about that. But I guess so I don't know how you want to take the conversation exactly. But if I were to talk about from a kind of organizational level, the problems or the challenges. And maybe that fits better into this part of the conversation, then I'd be interested in talking about some of the organizational challenges and even hearing from others on the panel about the kinds of organizational challenges that they're facing around, again, fundraising, membership, et cetera. But if we're talking about the opportunities, I would kind of go off.
Well, but it's fine. No, go ahead. And certainly, I definitely want us to get to that question about how organizations are coping exactly with those kind of questions. So if you kind of start off, and you'll help lead us in that direction.
Yeah, well, I mean, I'm thinking about, having been on the foundation side of the table. I mean, and in the role of somebody who spent most of his life actually on the other side of the table, fundraising. But I'm not exactly in that world now, so I'm a little out of date. But I'd be really interested to hear from others also about these kinds of challenges. I mean, I'm thinking about falling endowments, foundations having falling endowments, which is going to reduce the overall grant-making capacity of the major foundations. And a lot of this sector is very dependent on those major foundations, which itself is a problem. But that's a problem that maybe we have no choice but to confront more head on now. But anyway, so the dependency on foundations is a problem, and the side, the endowments. High net worth individuals these days are skittish. They're looking at the stock market, they're looking at their portfolios, they're not at all sure they want to make donations. NGOs famously, human rights NGOs famously have low levels of reserves. They often don't have reserves. They have a month or 2 months or something like that. There's this kind of seat of the pants and the pushing of money into program because that's what the groups do. They do the program, and they're reluctant to put the money into reserves, and the funders are reluctant to give them money for reserves. So that whole piece of the puzzle is now probably, I assume, hitting us hard. I know of a number of organizations that are having layoffs as a result of the crisis, and of course, those organizations, and there are some, one of which is of course Human Rights Watch, that depend on big events, on gala events and things like that, and you can't do those right now. So anyway, that's on the negative side, and it really worries me. But it also, raises all sorts of existential questions that I think are really interesting about, whether or not we, existential questions that were there, but are just thrown into sharper relief about the kind of ecosystems dependency on, solid NGOs, which have connections to social movements this way, and then, are getting funding primarily from the big foundations this way. And that ecosystem may be overly dependent on that kind of structure, and that may be getting thrown into sharp relief now, even though it was always a problem, always a challenge, and it's not an easy challenge. I'm not suggesting there are easy answers out of that, but to quickly segue a little bit into the positive side, I don't know if people have seen this research by Erica Chenoweth and others about kind of new forms of protest. And I find this totally fascinating. I mean, things like, car caravans, online teach-ins, even things like the music on balconies that we read so much about, people singing on balconies and clanging pots and stuff. It doesn't seem directly like protest, but nonetheless is a form of social mobilization. Rent strike, in Spain primarily, but maybe other places too. These are really interesting kinds of social mobilization things that we see kind of percolating and out there. So to link those two things, if we need to meet people where they're at, and maybe, and I don't know if I can make a prediction like this, but maybe there's some opportunities here to think about those new forms of mobilization, and especially the online stuff, which is such a pain in the neck most of the time. But I find anyway, I don't like it most of the time, and I'd much rather be outside. But on the other hand, I'm also, in a very personal level, I'm not having as many meetings, I'm not traveling as much, and that's kind of okay with me on some level. I'm talking about a very particular position as somebody who, has, that's not a real problem in the world, obviously. But what I'm getting at is the possibility of maybe finding forms of online organizing and other things that come out of this that may be positive. I don't know if those will solve the ecosystem problems that I was talking about before. But anyway, those are some rambling thoughts.
No, that was great, and thank you for kind of taking us into really the whole question of sort of innovation and resilience. One question that's come up in the chat room, which I want to kind of throw out now to you and the others on the panel, because I think it actually fits nicely and builds very nicely on what you've just been talking about, Louis, is the question of whether or not restrictions on travel and the lockdowns that we're all living will force international NGOs to be much more creative about their relationships with national NGOs, because you can't get on a plane and go to wherever the way one might have done. It's only through working with local NGOs that one can get the work done. This is something you've been working on for many years, and you and I worked together on this when you were at Ford. But I'm interested to hear from others as well as to whether the challenges are on our ability to move around, are making us think differently and creatively about how to partner with others online and in other ways, in our research, in our advocacy, in our mobilization and organization. Marcy, do you want to say a word on that?
Yeah, I would love to. Thank you for the opportunity. And it just builds so much on so many of the really helpful points that all of the other panelists have made. But I can say from my own work, which, Women Deliver is a global advocacy organization focused on gender equality and the health and rights of girls and women. And my particular role at Women Deliver is that I manage the humanitarian program. So sort of everything to do with advocating for girls and women who are in crisis contexts. And the program that I made quick reference to earlier in Lebanon is about amplifying the voices and the solutions that are being created by grassroots women's organizations. Some that are refugee-led organizations, others that are Lebanese organizations, all sort of working together to try to improve the health and rights of girls and women in that country. And what we've noted is that for those organizations that are our partners, and also just for the network of grassroots women's organizations doing this work around the world, we're truly talking about them being in danger of extinction for all of the reasons that Jessica and others so brilliantly explained. Access to funding, you know, trying to continue to match the demands on their personal lives and their professional lives. It's an overwhelming challenge at the moment. And to be honest, I find this really ironic because at the same time that these organizations are facing such acute challenges to their survival, we need them more than ever because this is not the time when traditional humanitarian response is able to parachute in, as so many international organizations are apt to do, to come in and try to solve the problem. This is not a time when those organizations can come, and so it means that the local responses are in fact the only responses that are going to work. At the same time, we haven't yet seen innovative thinking at scale for what's required to challenge this problem. So, for example, the UN several weeks back put out a global humanitarian appeal for about $2 billion. That is frankly mostly going to go to UN agencies to try to implement around the world. Some UN agencies, I want to be fair, are great subcontractors and great at subgranting those funds, sort of trickling down a cascade of a number of different international organizations so they finally get into the pockets of these grassroots women's organizations that I'm talking about for they themselves to do that life-saving work. But I have heard that a number of UN agencies are planning to not subcontract any of those funds that will be received through the global COVID appeal, which is shocking to me. What is their strategy to be able to respond at the community level? They're simply not going to be able to do it. I want to share a little bit about the innovative ways that that my team has been trying to think about workarounds in the very limited ways that we're able to work with our partners. We're not a grant-making organization. We don't provide any financial support to the organizations we work with. Instead, our focus is on capacity building, training, and then support to bring these organizations to global platforms where they're able to share their messages with people who need to hear from them. Of course, basically every major policy moment that was supposed to happen in 2020, and already things are being pushed to next year, and things that were scheduled for early next year are already being postponed, all of that is canceled, right? So that has opened up a significant amount of funding that we're going to spend on visas and plane tickets, etc. And so something that we're going to be doing with that funding is trying to meet the needs of the increased tech demands on all of the grassroots organizations. So for example, we're working out dedicated stipends, basically translating those plane tickets into increased dollars to be able to keep their WhatsApp hotlines going, to be able to keep their internet on, to be able to keep the lights on in the shelters where they work, recognizing the sort of increased demands they have on their time and on their resources. You know, in Lebanon in particular, there is an economic and political crisis happening simultaneously with the refugee crisis and COVID. There's so many layers of challenges. We're trying to understand the ways that we can help and really do some creative problem solving around that. One other thing that I'll mention is that you know, normally a moment like this, of course, would have been in person, not via Zoom. Webinars are just the way that work is being done right now. And I think that actually, although we're not seeing it at scale yet, I think that webinars can be a great equalizer in terms of the way that we do our advocacy. The majority of my time is generally spent knocking on the doors of policymakers and decision makers on high, asking for them not to listen to people like myself, but to listen to the women on the ground in the field who are doing this work, who are the ones who have both the life experience and the stories and the solutions that need to be heard in global policy meetings. but too frequently, because of challenges getting visas to the United States when there are numerous countries that are banned from entering, when prices are astronomical and out of reach for most grassroots organizations, there are so many barriers to entry that it's rare for these women's organizations to be able to speak. Just to share one quick anecdote to be able to put this to light, one of the organizations I partner with is this incredible group called Women Now for Development. It's a group of Syrian refugee women who have started an organization for other Syrian refugees inside Syria, in Turkey, and in Lebanon. Their executive director is a colleague, and we had been working in 2019, last year, to organize to have her come to a major UN event that happens every March focused on women's rights in New York City. So we applied for the visa. Literally a full year later, March 2020, she gets the visa, and 2 days later, the event was canceled because of COVID-19. These are the kind of challenges that we're working with. It's very complicated to get the kinds of people you want to hear from in these spaces. And yet a webinar, right, is a space that anyone who has, you know, internet connection, which is not, which I shouldn't gloss over. It's difficult to have consistent access to internet. But in principle, there are innovative ways that we can make sure that we're hearing from those voices more consistently. And so a new part of our advocacy is making sure that in this time when we're speaking to each other in this way, that we're making sure to speak to the right people.
Can I jump in on something? Sorry.
Go ahead, Louis. Yes, sure.
Well, I was just going to amplify. I thought that was Marcy's intervention was great, and I just wanted to amplify it with a kind of recurring theme that I've heard over the past many years, which is, why is it that the international NGOs have such big travel budgets and the local NGOs don't get that money in a way? I mean, that's one of the way it's kind of been framed, is, and obviously there are reasons for that. I mean, I'm a big fan of international NGOs, and I think they're important. But nonetheless, that kind of inequity, I mean, an international NGO is much more expensive than a local NGO. And one of the main reasons it's more expensive is because of the travel budgets. And the travel budgets are so that they can go to and meet with the local partners. So that's a kind of structural problem, again, with that kind of, use that metaphor again, with the ecosystem. And what's really interesting, Marcy, about what you were saying is that, that problem's been there, but again, it's being thrown into sharp relief by this. And now we have no choice because there is the travel budget money. We say, okay, well, we can actually use that for these other things, and there are opportunity costs. So obviously there's certain things you can't do because you're making that budgetary shift. But nonetheless, it's a really interesting thing, and I think that's something that maybe will come out of this. Exactly as you were saying, just to amplify what you were saying. I mean, it may be that the tech solutions, as much as we all hate Zoom or whatever, are going to allow for more voice, more participation from partners, more. I'm looking right now at my screen, which is the grid form. Everybody is the same size on this screen. There's something about that is a democratizing element of a kind of global social movement. So like the human rights movement. So yeah, anyway.
That's great. I want to come back to a couple of your points, which I think are really interesting about new opportunities. But Arielle and Jessica, I know both have to leave just after 1. So I want to make sure that you both have a chance to weigh in before you go. I'd love you both to pick up on sort of what we've been talking about the last few minutes, is sort of how you're changing the way you work, and what are some of the new opportunities that you're seeing in terms of, for you, Arielle, kind of how you do your field organizing, and for you, Jessica, how you engage with LGBTQI groups and communities around the world. So maybe Arielle.
Yeah, thank you. So I think that one thing that we've seen most specifically is that a new world is possible. And I say that not with grand aspirations, but an actual reality. Specifically, we had already been moderating our travel policy because of climate change. And so now we see that there are new forms of, or other forms, alternative forms of activism that folks can take. And we're really excited about that. There was a question in the chat about how we've been engaging with communities that we haven't before. And I think we've been engaging now with new tactics that we didn't once think were possible. So the fact that we're moving very close to a stance on, de-incarceration, full de-incarceration, or in total de-incarceration, is definitely something that's very exciting. Thinking about, significant changes to behavior, et cetera, are things that we're considering as well. But I think the one caveat I worry about, specifically as a member-based organization, our members are very much used to organizing in person. The virtual side of things is, was integrated into our work, but our members are definitely more comfortable being in person, and now we have to move 100% virtual. I worry about screen fatigue. I worry about just constantly staring at a computer screen trying to mobilize. It's difficult, and I don't think it's a fixture at all, and I don't think it's necessarily a overarching benefit, but it is something that I think that we'll have to confront pretty soon, because even in my own workload, I've been on screen probably 50, 60 times, and it's just exhausting. And I would imagine for a volunteer activist, it's even more so after a long day's work. So those are just some things that we're considering. In the chat box, I've dropped my email address. I've also dropped our Distance But Together COVID Human Rights Response page. I encourage everyone to participate and get involved. We have a number of opportunities for folks. And I have to say, once again, just thank you all so much for having me here today.
Arielle, thanks very much for your insights. It's been really, really good to hear them. So we really appreciate the time you found to be with us. Jessica, let me turn to you before you go. How are you innovating? How are you engaging perhaps in a different way with partners and communities around the world, or in the eight the 8 countries that you mentioned that you specifically work in?
Thanks, Iain. We work in about 30 countries. We have offices in 8. No problem. No problem at all. You'll just have to come to another webinar where I tell you all about Outright. Instead of going in the optimistic direction that you just suggested, I want to take us back to the depressing issues of a few minutes ago. I want to talk about the financial implications of the crisis on human rights organizations. And I think all of my colleagues on the panel have made some really astute and interesting observations. But, for a Columbia University audience, it feels really important to name that, the work of social change is work that is done through blood, sweat, and tears, and money often makes it go a lot faster. Money can accelerate the pace of change. And that's why many of us choose to do community organizing, research, and policy work in the context of nonprofits. For example, I'm here with you today because I'm fortunate enough to have a job working for a human rights organization. And I think the potential devastation to philanthropy that will come from the COVID crisis is almost unimaginable right now. My organization, Outright, is 30 years old. We are more stable, we are more secure, we are more fortunate than very many LGBTIQ organizations around the world. And Outright is anticipating what will likely be a 30% contraction in revenue next year. Just absorb that number for a moment, 30% contraction in revenue. Even a stable organization suffers deeply with such a large budget cut. And I hope and pray that there's like a fairy godmother on this call right now who's gonna contact me afterwards, jstern@outrightinternational.org, and just write like a check and make my worries go away and make my sleep deep at night. But I tell you that to say, that if that's how a strong and stable LGBTIQ organization anticipates being impacted by the crisis, imagine what it's like for even more grassroots organizations. Imagine what it's like for the trans organization that finally got up and running last year, or the LBQ organization that was on the verge of legally registering. I can tell you, these are my friends and my colleagues, and I talk to them all the day. And if they're lucky enough to have funding, it is not diversified funding. They have a couple of donors at best. And in the early years, it's a combination of very grassroots support from individual community members and maybe some of the more progressive foundations. yeah, so I'm scared. And I think it's really important to say that. And I really loved the creativity that my fellow panelists were naming as possibilities in this moment. But at the same time, I'm still in the sorrow moment. And so just to flesh this out a little bit, Outright decided to organize this emergency COVID fund. And in less than 3 weeks, we received 1,400 emergency applications. That is a very, very high number of applications expressing urgent appeal. And so now I have about $13 million in urgent requests for funding. And I was just in a staff meeting before this, and we were discussing, like, how do we talk about who we're giving grants to and who we're not? And someone said, well, we'll just have to say that we rejected like 99% of the appeals. And I said, no, we didn't reject them. Like, the resources didn't meet the demands. And if you can imagine that we got 1,400 requests in a few weeks, that's just the tip of the iceberg, right? The humanitarian crisis is actually 2, 3, 4, many times greater than that. And so since I'm going to have to jump off, I'm going to try to think of something positive to say so that you all don't, send me hate mail for being so depressing in an already depressing time. But I'll say, like, the thing that's keeping me going and giving me hope is that this is also a moment of tremendous community solidarity. People are stepping up. There was a question somewhere in the chat about, I think it was in the focus of detention, but it's also a broader question. Are you working with new stakeholders? Are there unlikely suspects coming out as allies? And the answer is yes. We've seen tremendous support. In fact, we did a webinar where we were previewing some of our research, and we sent an invitation to some governments. And maybe it sounds like there are a lot of current and future advocates on the call. Usually when you contact governments, you have to hound them. I think, as Marcy was saying, like, you get in their face and you try to get them to listen to you, and it's not easy. Well, we sent out one invitation and over a dozen governments showed up to ask what they could do. And that's not usual. That's not business as usual. So I do also feel like, while we're all in crisis, some of us are saying, this is the moment to do more. And the reason why this is the moment to do more is because our actions today will determine the course of our lives and the course of human rights for years, if not generations to come. So I guess it's an appeal to step up with whatever you have.
Those are very inspiring words to end with. So, or to end your remarks with. So, thank you, Jessica, for joining us. Really appreciate your time and your thoughts on this issue. I want to go back to Marcy and Louis. I mean, I thought you both made really interesting comments about creativity and finding new opportunities and being forced to think in new ways, and some ways, doing better because you're forced to rethink relationships. The way you, Louis, for example, talked about why we spend so much money on international travel for international NGOs. We should be investing that money in national, local partners in the global south. And Marcy, you talked about needing to focus more on making sure the internet was turned on in Lebanon than worrying about you or colleagues getting on a plane. I thought that was really interesting. Jessica's last point I thought was really powerful, and I 100% agree with it. We're going to see the future of, I think, the movement for the next several years defined by the next several months potentially, and how we manage COVID and the post-COVID reality, whatever that looks like. In exactly the same way that I think we're seeing a real risk of the United Nations system becoming increasingly irrelevant because of the enormous problems it's having in providing leadership on this issue. I mean, if you think about the fact this is perhaps not directly related to the work of human rights NGOs, but I think for me, it's incredibly significant. The UN Security Council, to this day, the most powerful and important body of the UN system, has failed to say anything about COVID. it hasn't been able to say anything, and they're still fighting because they can't agree on what to say about the World Health Organization, let alone a statement from the UN Security Council, which would recognize that COVID has an incredibly important human rights dimension that has to be addressed if the pandemic is going to be addressed in an effective and a just way. So I want to come back to you both about thinking creatively about how we move forward, how we find new opportunities, and how we maybe even recognize, despite the funding constraints, which Jessica, I think, raised in a very powerful way, we can think creatively about new ways to move forward. Louis, any more thoughts from your side?
Sure, if I have that many new ones in addition to what's come up. I mean, I do think that everything really is going to change quite a bit around nonprofits and international organizing. I think it's going to be really different, and in some ways, Marcy, you're helping to consolidate that thought in my head, which was inchoate until now, but I feel like it's beginning to kind of be a little bit more consolidated, the notion that, like, I mean, this thing about jumping on a plane, I mean, I've spent my whole career jumping on planes. I mean, the carbon footprint thing is awful. It's awful. I jump on planes once a month and go someplace, and that's not ideal at all. It's not ideal for anybody to do it that way. And if we can find these other ways of doing things that don't involve that, that's good. It's good for the planet. It's good for partnerships. It's good for empowerment. It's good for, the digital divide question, which you also mentioned and we shouldn't gloss over, is really significant. But and it's true that a lot of the local partners we're talking about don't, necessarily have the same kind of access. On the other hand, maybe that's where the investment should go, is into that kind of infrastructure. So I see some really interesting possibilities there around that. By the way, one little thing I just wanted to insert quickly, because I know we only have 10 minutes or so left, is and I'm wondering if anybody else has been participating, because they didn't show the participants on this Zoom call I was on, but I was part of this COVID, what's it called? Contact tracing, electronic contact tracing group. Anyway, I was trying to remember the exact title of it. Was anybody else on that call? So this is important stuff. I mean, this is really important. Electronic contact tracing. And, the whole idea that when you walk into a supermarket, your cell phone tells you that somebody next to you has, whatever, and whether they're opt-in or whatever. So anyway, that's just something I was curious about if other people were following it all. I think it's a really important topic because, obviously, the administration could go way the wrong way on that kind of stuff in terms of monitoring people's behavior and getting deep down into people's privacy and things like that. So I thought that might come up on the call, but I was glad to see this very good group of people. That one of the chairs of it is McLaughlin, is that his name? Andrew McLaughlin, who's connected to Access now, it was one of the hosts of that meeting. Anyway, it was very good, and there were some very high-level people on it talking very seriously about that topic.
There's been a lot of conversation on I think I would say more broadly on the importance of tech. I mean, if one sector has come out sort of with its influence enhanced, both for the good and not for the good, it's obviously the tech sector. And whether it's its ability to ensure we get access to good information, it's work to try and tamp down on fake news and disinformation. It's clearly playing an ever more critical role. And I think you're absolutely right. This whole question about surveillance apps and how we set the right limits and how we find the balance in human rights law between the exigencies of a public health pandemic which threatens millions of lives and the need to protect our fundamental rights is we don't have time to go into it now, but it's really critical. We only have a few minutes left, and if I may, both of you, I just want to end up by asking a slightly more personal question, is sort of how we are all, how you are, and I'm happy to weigh in too, dealing with some of the more personal individual challenges of this time, and how are you personally and working with your colleagues and partners in different parts of the world, how are you trying to balance your professional human rights activism and the challenges of doing that we've been talking about? How are you trying to balance that with some of the personal challenges of dealing with the pandemic and family and other questions. I'd be interested to hear anything you'd like to say as we wrap up the conversation. Marcy?
Yeah, thank you for the opportunity. And I really appreciate bringing that question and that conversation into this larger conversation, because actually in and of itself, it sort of helps answer the question for me. Because one of the ways that I've been coping is trying to do just this in every meeting that I have, which is a lot of meetings every day. Just a constant sort of check-in with my colleagues, whether they're internal to my organization or external, and to make it sort of a part of the way that we communicate with each other. Because there is camaraderie in how hard this is, even though we are all challenged in different ways. I have a 2-year-old, which was really poor planning on my part to have a toddler at the same time as this crisis. My husband and I both work full-time, super demanding jobs. And when this began, we sort of said like, well, we'll just wake up really early and work before she wakes up, and we'll stay up late working after she goes to bed. And you do that for a couple of weeks and are completely burnt out. So that's not reasonable to expect. So we're just all doing the best that we can. And what's been amazing to me is that as I connect with friends and colleagues who are living alone in 300 square feet, or are living with their families that they haven't lived together with since they were in high school and now are in their 30s, like everyone is struggling in different ways. And I think that everyone is feeling jealous of what someone else's situation is, because everyone else's situation seems like it must be easier than my own situation, because this is just the hardest. I know that I feel that way. So I think that the most important thing that we can do is just to talk to each other about it, to share tips and tricks for what's working for us in moments and times, and just to keep that conversation about self-care alive. And the very last thing that I'll just say is that one of the things that we are offering to our grassroots organizations that we work with, not just in Lebanon, but around the world, is that we're organizing in the next 2 weeks to do a self-care focused webinar with them, specifically focused on healing for feminist activists, and have found these incredible healers around the world, and are going to be doing this webinar in 3 different languages. And Zoom is going to help us do that with breakout rooms and translators. It's going to be wild, but also just like thinking outside the box about the ways that we can use the resources that we have to nurture and support the people who we touch.
I'll swap my 16 and 13-year-old for your 2-year-old. Louis?
Go ahead, Iain. Why don't you take the floor?
Yeah, I mean, I think you spoke well, Marcy. I mean, my kids are older, and so different challenges from working with a toddler, but similarly, trying to balance home and work. And my wife works in international public health, so she's working on COVID 15 hours a day, and trying to just keep things going and stay in touch with family. I have elderly parents in the UK and worry about them, and it's I don't think there are any easy lessons, but as you say, I think lots of communication and I mean, work obviously I think is incredibly important it always has been for me personally, but it gives a tremendous sense of purpose at a difficult time. But it's also been interesting how many people I have reached out to who I had lost touch with perhaps in recent times, or how many people have reached out to me. I think we're all looking for a sense of community. Obviously, we're finding it online more than we are in person, but I found that's been a really just helpful way of dealing with the uncertainty of it all and the anxiety of it all. Worrying about my kids when they're going to go back to school, and as we all are, worrying about where the human rights movement is going, and trying to figure out how to be helpful, useful, and creative at such a difficult time. And for me personally, I run every morning, and that's what keeps me sane and more or less balanced for the rest of the day.
I was going to ask
Louis?
you about marathons and running. It's good.
Well, all my races have been cancelled, but I found a very, very deserted part of Brooklyn that I go in at 7 o'clock every morning, and I can run for 40 minutes and not see anybody, which is nice.
Yeah, that's what keeps me sane too. I'm pretty much here all the time, but I take a daily walk, and I find deserted streets here in Bushwick, and it's actually kind of nice. So I'm able to do that. But thank you all. I mean, those are all, I have similar, you know, I would just kind of repeat things that have been said. So.
Kristina, we're coming to the end of time, so I really want to thank you for putting all this together and giving me the chance to moderate and choosing such a great bunch of people to be on the panel. I want to thank everyone who's on the call. Again, I just want to say it was really nice to see some of my former students, so I'm really happy to see you here. And you know, I hope that we can have more conversations of this kind. You know, we've touched on so many different human rights related issues, you know, substantive questions, you know, affected groups and discriminations, how different governments are abusing the pandemic and using it as a pretext to advance repression, discrimination, consolidation of power. And I think some of the questions we talked about today around, you know, the future of human rights work, of organizing, of mobilizing, of fundraising are absolutely critical. They're going to be key issues for months, if not years to come. And I hope we can continue this conversation. I would certainly love to be part of it. And just again, thank you very much for giving me and the others on the panel a chance to weigh in with our thoughts and our ideas about how these issues can be addressed. So thank you. And thank you all for being on the call. I know these are really busy times, balancing work and personal demands. So really appreciate people finding the time to be with us today and to write in some good questions. We didn't cover all the questions that some of you submitted. I'm sorry about that, but hopefully we covered at least some of the critical issues that you were wanting us to touch on. So thank you, everybody.
Thank you, Evan, very much. Thank you to Iain and the rest of our panelists and for all of you for joining us. And we look forward to future conversations. So thank you.
Thank you so much.
Take
care, everyone. Stay safe.
Appreciate it.
Bye, everybody.
Bye, Kerry.